friends, family, strangers. Hopefully you're not a stranger by the end of this podcast. Thank you for joining us for another Journey on the Fly, the podcast, where we talk about fly fishing and life. And as you are probably experiencing on some of these more recent podcasts, you're getting a little bit more of a feel of who I am as far as my worldview. And I'm not overly selective on my guests, although it may seem like that for a while. But I'm open to a lot of guests and a lot of ideas. Speaking of guests and ideas, I am, as always, and I mean it the same every time, very excited to bring in a new guest, Howie Fischer. Howie is a husband. He is a family man. He's a man of God by his own admission, and he loves fly fishing. Very excited to introduce you all to him, to his world, and what he is open to share and what we can learn from him. So stay tuned. We're going to get into that in just a minute. And as a friendly reminder, you can find us on Spotify, iHeart, Apple Podcasts, or on our website at journeyonthefly.fish under the More tab there in podcast. We also have a blog that we are lacking in, so we are working on that as well, and some other things that are coming up. What I would ask you to please do is, if you enjoy this podcast, leave us a 5-star review. It doesn't have to be an entire paragraph or novel. Something simple that will help other people find our content, that will help us grow this podcast and hopefully encourage others and bring the advice and so forth that we hope we do bring through our guests and some of our recordings. So with all that said, let's get into our discussion with Howie. How would you describe yourself?
Oh, man, that's a good question. I feel like you kind of hit the nail on the head. So I think first and foremost, I try and obviously be a man of God, and of course that influences how I try to be a family man to the best of my ability. But yeah, just an avid outdoorsman. Love really just God's creation. I think that's a huge part of me, and has even become more. I mean, it's always been a part of me. I grew up outdoors, grew up playing sports and so on and so forth. And but I mean, just some of my earliest memories in life are being outside with my family, camping, fishing, so on and so forth, and that has kind of just stuck with me, and even really just taken a new meaning as an adult of just needing that time and solitude and silence and creation, especially with two young kids.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit. So to be fair to anybody that is just dropping in on this, one of the things they're kind of seeing the change of my podcast over time is that I have made a decision to not hide who I am, but I wasn't trying to hide before, but to be a little bit more intentional about my worldview coming out in interviews, but not so much where it's like, this isn't a debate podcast per se.
Yeah.
Although I'm always open to that. And I'm also never going to have just hosts that hold my own worldview, because that's also ridiculous, because there's a lot of good information and people and so forth out there. But you kind of emphasized, so I would like to park on that a little bit. So because I don't take anything for granted anymore in my, I'd like to call my wiser years, what do you mean by your relationship with God? Like, unpack that a little bit, because that could mean a whole lot of things, as I'm assuming you already know. But I'm curious how you would unpack that to help us understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you're absolutely right. So, yeah, so I mean, I've always had a relationship with God. I grew up in a quote unquote Christian household, but our faith, I think, as a family, kind of became real and an everyday part of our life when I was in middle school, really, and that's when God really grabbed hold of me. But it's been since then. So obviously, I was a high schooler, and not perfect, but I was striving to try and know God more, and church and my faith was a huge part of my life. And I ended up going to a Christian college, met my wife there. For those of you that have been in that scene, fulfilled the whole ring by spring prophecy unintentionally. Just a very serious part of my life, and at least striving to be. And now I'm actually so I graduated my degree in psychology and wanted to do marriage and family therapy. And then, just in my, as I mentioned, my faith is a very, very serious part of my life. And I strive for that to be an everyday thing. And I say it that way because I know I'm not perfect. Paul basically says I'm the worst sinner that I know, right? And I'm the chief sinner of all sinners. And I try and, hold true to that. Not try to hold true to that, but try and be aware of that, I should say,
right.
Every day. And so I'm actually in seminary now, working on my Master's of Divinity to become a pastor. And so, yeah, and that's to go back to your question, that's something that we're trying to teach our children, and instill in them is a very real faith. So yeah, does that answer your question a little bit?
Oh no, that's fantastic. I appreciate that. That brought some clarity. So, as a little bit of a rabbit trail, I know that from looking at some of your interweb bios, you work with an organization. Do you still work with the organization Altar Fly Fishing?
I do. Yes, I'm on staff with Altar.
Okay. Tell us
part-time.
Tell us a little bit about that, because so I was a pastor for 4 years. I never wanted to work in the church because all the ministry stuff I ever did was always outside of the church, and it was always a fight to get the people from in the pews, out of the pews, to actually do what I would consider the work of the ministry. Live this thing out as you're describing the struggle of life as a Christian is. And the fact from being a pastor for a while and being very close with some pastors, seeing the kind of a lot of struggles that goes on that people are not aware of. And when I stumbled across Altar, long before I think I ever stumbled across you, I just think it's a good thing. So without me describing it, tell us what Altar's about.
Yeah, I absolutely love what we do at Altar. And, I was just writing year-end letters and to donors and people who support me and what we do at Altar. And I really just loved writing those letters because it reminded me of why I and what we do at Altar. So we are a nonprofit, and we started out about, I think 2025 will be year 6, if I'm not mistaken. I've been with Altar in a staff role. This will be my 3rd year. But so we are a fly fishing retreat organization. And so one of our sayings has become, we want to merge faith and fly fishing into a common stream. And so our goal really on our retreats is retreat first and then fly fishing second. So fly fishing is obviously a huge part of what we do, but our main goal is really a retreat and to offer a place of solace and rest and really recovery for pastors specifically. That's kind of our heart, our bread and butter as pastors, and that's what we set out to do. It's morphed over the years and kind of become different things. We do offer just men's trips and women's trips, and we do so we do pastor specific trips, but then we also do ministry leader trips, so just anybody in ministry. And sometimes some trips look like a mix of everything. But our focus really is, like I said, pastors, and kind of like you were getting at, kind of hit the nail on the head of there's so much that goes on behind the scenes that a lot of people don't really realize, who aren't in that role, and it just completely weighs on pastors and ministry leaders. The saying is very true. It's not just a saying that the top is lonely, right? And that's not just for people who are in, CEOs and stuff like that, but it's also true for pastors. A lot of pastors don't have people that they can talk to in their immediate context, or even in their life in general. And so I personally love being on and helping to lead the trips with pastors, because we see a lot of pastors come in one place and leave with a renewed hope or vision or calling even for their life in ministry. And really what facilitates that is creating a place on our retreats where we're giving pastors time to pause. We call it throttling down, kind of like, from that image of driving a manual car, of like, okay, we're running at 100 miles an hour 24/7, basically. Even pastors who are supposed to be these examples of, living, I don't want to say the right life, but you get what I mean when I say that, I think. But they're running 100 miles an hour 24/7, and they're getting burnt out simply because of the pace of life, not even necessarily because of the demands of the job. That definitely has a toll to play in it as well. But so we create this space for pastors or men or women who come on these retreats to throttle down, to say, okay, we're running our lives into the ground. How do we pause, slow down, reflect on that, and then we don't just leave it there. So our goal is that we then continue to walk through life with these pastors as best as we're able and they're able. So our retreats aren't just retreats. It's not like a summer camp experience kind of where you go have a great experience and then go back home. But we actually on our retreats help pastors create plans to go back into their context, to go back into their life, and continue on with what we work on at the retreats, and come up with a plan for Sabbath and for rest and for leading healthy lives. So,
and how does the fly fishing part of that play into it? And on a side note, I'm glad that I know the demographics of my listeners, because I was going to have you explain what a manual car was there for a minute. But I know that most of the listeners are of age that they've experienced that at least one time in their life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, with that being said, I mean, I've learned how to drive stick, but I certainly am not a professional. So, so yeah, that's a great question. So fly fishing has a very actually key role in what we do. And it's kind of one of those things where it's like, yeah, it's awesome, but it's also very intentional. So there's a lot of crossover, and obviously water is a very key biblical theme in a lot of ways in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Water is huge in so many ways. And so there's that aspect of it being a very biblical, very key metaphor, reality, so on and so forth. And we kind of play on that throughout the course of our retreats and in our content. And so there's a couple sayings. I mean, one, you've probably heard this before, but if you don't fish your fly, the river will fish it for you. Uh-huh. And so we play on, we usually open our retreats with that saying, and say the same thing about life. Like if you don't fish your life, life will fish it for you. And it's like, if you're not intentional about being intentional, for lack of better terms, life's going to take hold. Life's going to happen. We've all probably used that saying before. Life happens, right? And it's true. And then there's really just a lot of, like I said, crossover between kind of spirituality and what we're doing. You know, I think any listener who's listening to this podcast knows you can't rush fly fishing. If you're trying to make a cast, especially to a trout or even, you know, a lot of saltwater fish, right? Most of the time you're making an intentional cast. And, you know, if you're trying to cast to a trout, even if it's, you know, rising or not, you know, and you're looking over to the right at how the leaves are blowing or a car driving by, whatever, you're not going to make that cast, right? Maybe you'll get close. But, you know, maybe you're going to slam your line down on the water and spook, you know, blow the whole hole up or spook the fish, or you're going to get caught in a tree that you're, you know, not looking at. You know, you get the point.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of one of the things too that we talk about on the trip is like being intentional. And then too, we open up our retreats on comparing our lives to the life cycle of a bug. So, you know, are you a nymph stage, you know, merger? Are you floating high and dry in life in a good way? Are you tangled mess? You know, so it's kind of weathered in and out. But then also too, like, there's obviously just something so beautiful about fly fishing. And, you know, as fly fishers, again, everybody who's listening to this podcast, I'm assuming is a fly fisher. We obviously go fly fishing for a very specific reason, and that's to get out in nature. And for us as Christians, that's to connect with God, and connect with his creation and just relish in that beauty. And again, there's just such a peaceful aspect of fly fishing. And so it pairs hand in hand of, okay, you know, we're coming from this crazy busy life, and we're not just going to sit in a room for 24 hours or, you know, 12 hours, whatever you want to say, and think about our feelings and our thoughts, which is all good, but we're also going to go kind of put it into practice and then play off both of them.
Wow. There's a lot there.
Yeah.
and no, I appreciate the ministry. It's why I wanted you to discuss it. I wanted to say something about the intentionality though, because I am kind of suffer from some compulsory things as I learn and grow myself, that when I hear things, to use a modern day nomenclature, I'm triggered in good ways when I hear words like intentionality, because I have a lot of friends with a lot of different views. And one of the things that is, I think, fundamental and true about every person on the planet is they have a worldview. And a worldview is different than just being we'll pick on us as a Christian per se, because worldview involves intentionality when it's understood properly, because of the fact that, you know, you can be a Christian and just go through the day and have no idea outside of church and maybe a prayer group at work what it has any application to, or what God has to say or do about anything else. Where worldview understood properly with that intentionality behind it says, how do I make sense of where we came from? What's wrong with the world? How do we fix it? You know, is there a way to fix it? All those kinds of things that most people take as assumptions. But you said it earlier on when you said, out of my faith comes how I parent, how I'm a husband. And that's a huge thing, but it's one of many things that people kind of often forget, that they are treating other people, they're treating the world, they're treating the planet for that matter, the fishery, whatever, based on their view of reality. They just haven't thought much about it. And I love the fact that not only through Altar are you building that intentionality about fish to fly, don't let life just happen to you. Plus, my son would go nuts and be shaking and rolling his eyes because of all the fly fishing analogies that you've brought up already. He's like, another one? I'm like, yeah, it's just full of them. But
yeah.
But also the fact, and I want to actually carry on a conversation with you guys outside of this to see if you're willing to share information, because I like the fact that you guys help develop plans for people to continue that rest and that Sabbath, find a way out of the crazy for a little bit on purpose, or here's more intentionality. That's really important to me because of an organization that I work for that is in the same vein as far as kind of what we do. We just do it to a specific, a different group of people, but nevertheless, well, out of all this so far, who do you think, in your view, is been the most influential person in your life?
Oh my gosh. Wasn't expecting that question.
It could be a couple people.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I have to go with a couple people. So, I think my parents and my dad especially. I mean, both my parents have been awesome. They're not, they're humans. They're not perfect people. And if they had listened to this, they'll probably laugh at that and roll their eyes maybe. But, yeah, I mean, they were just always there. And I think that's a huge thing. And that's something that we talk about, my wife and I. So we both used to work in the public school system, and it was like, with everything going on with the public school system now, and that has been, and I've had this conversation with a lot of different people, is like the difference between kids who succeed and don't succeed are the kids who have parents present and who are active in their lives. And of course you can go on and give qualifications if you want to. But like, I think, thinking of your question is like that, my parents were present in my life, and were good parents, and were there for me when I needed them, and so on and so forth. And so I think my parents definitely, and my dad, and there's definitely some very instrumental conversations that I remember to this day that most of them were not great conversations in the moment because I was in trouble, or being, dumb. But looking back on them, I'm just like, holy cow, like they were those tough love moments. And they stick with me to this day. And two, like one, for example, I wanted to go to, I played soccer through college, and in middle school, I wanted to, my team was in the playoffs and so on and so forth. And I wanted to go to the game, and we ended up winning the game even without me. But my dad had signed me up for this mission trip to inner city Baltimore. And, that was where like God really revealed himself to me. And, I literally could remember standing in the doors of this church in inner city Baltimore and saying to myself, wow, this is real. And so like those kinds of moments, like I said, and at the time he probably didn't, I mean, I'm sure he was praying for me and, hoping that this moment would happen, but I don't know if he necessarily thought that moment would lead to, where I am now. But yeah, so definitely my parents. And then also too, I think, the pastors that we've had at our church. So I currently work at, the church that I grew up in, actually, more or less grew up in. And, the senior pastor, when we started attending, that organized that mission trip, he's retired now and in his late 80s. But definitely him, huge impact on my faith. And then also the pastor that came in after him, also huge impact on my faith, and really a huge part of who I am today. So yeah, I think that probably sums up that.
Well, so I met you, whether you remember it or not, and part of that's intentional on my side. last year at the Lancaster Fly Fishing Show,
Mm-hmm.
or not 2 years ago, excuse me. Actually going on 3 maybe. Anyways, we had went to with a group of people, and I was with one of the people there. It was a bar club. There was like 3 clubs or bars all in one building. It was crazy.
Yeah.
I enjoy the taste of quality beer, but I hate just, maybe it's because of my old crankiness or because I spend so much time outdoors. I don't like being in a place I have to scream to the person 6 inches from me to talk.
Yeah.
But I also like to just listen a lot.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people reveal a lot about themselves that way too.
Mm-hmm.
But you were there with, I think if I remember, no, you were there with a couple companies. I know you were there with Angler's Coffee. I thought you were there with something else too. I thought you were bouncing, but maybe you stayed there the entire time. Say a little bit about that. I mean, Angler's Coffee is pretty cool. It seems like everybody's got a coffee with a label on it now. It's almost as bad as microbreweries everywhere.
Yeah.
But that's kind of an interesting thing because, just tell us about Angler's Coffee, because I know a little bit about their story, and I think it's neat.
Yeah. So that's kind of just, I mean, right place, right time, God ordination, and, lining things up. So I actually got connected with Angler's Coffee through a good friend of mine who runs his own digital media company. At the time, he was running their social media and doing, digital media content for them. And then just ended up getting to know the owner kind of through that. And so at the time he was doing, he lived local to me. He now lives in Montana. But we would do, he would do photo shoots for them and for other companies. So we would go out often and fish and do, I was his model. But we fished together once a week. But through Anglers specifically, I ended up getting to know the owner, and he was just like, what are your thoughts? What do you think is next for Anglers? And they started in the winter, spring of 2020. So hard time for any organization to get off the ground. But so I was like, you've got great following and already just from being online, but it's like, you got to get in front of people. So I was like, look, I go to these fly shows. I'm happy to run a booth for you. Let's do it. And so we did it. And it was cool. But yeah, the owner of Anglers is an awesome guy. And he's got a crazy story. Long story short, he was one of the founders of Seattle's Best Coffee.
Oh, he's a founder.
Yeah. Wow. So him and I don't know if you looked in the history, if you would find that information, but so his best friend from high school and his best friend's brother started roasting beans in their garage in Washington State, in Western Washington, and then ended up becoming Seattle's Best Coffee. And he worked for them, I think, for the first couple summers. But then he ended up becoming this was during the coffee boom in Seattle. He ended up getting into espresso machine repair, and he was the only guy in Seattle, which is hard to believe, that knew how to repair an espresso machine. And then ended up, through a series of events, buying a espresso machine company from Italy, and ended up becoming from the way I understand it, becoming the sole importer of espresso machines for Starbucks for a number of years. Wow. So I mean, he's been in the coffee business literally his whole adult life and really knows what he's doing, which is why the coffee really is good, and in my opinion does stand out, because it's not just, like you were saying, a label on a bag. It's no, he's very intentional about the way he does business, and especially does coffee. And so but it's just a really cool company. And like I said, I've been fortunate enough to really get to know the owner really well. And he's got to know, my wife and our kids and stuff like that. So, yeah. That's
fantastic. Is he an angler himself?
Yes, he is.
Oh,
yes.
Nice.
I guess that's a very key portion of that story as well. Yeah. So one of the slogans of Anglers is coffee for anglers by anglers. And that's actually true. Joe's a lifelong fly fisherman, and still fishes to this day. He lives on Whidbey Island in Washington, and I think fishes still once a week probably for coastal run cutthroats and salmon and stuff like that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So Howie, you do a little bit of fly tying.
I do. I'm actually currently fly tying.
So tell us a little bit about that. So where did the fly tying come from? And then I'm gonna poke you with some of the what I think as far as being a fly tyer would be some of the more harder questions to answer, just because it is one of those things it's very much like art.
Yeah, so I was actually just talking. I mean, I talk about this with my wife often. Like, never in a million years when I started tying flies did I imagine that I would be on a podcast or doing all these things that fly tying has opened the door for. And it's really just been such a fun experience and fun ride. And that's really why I do it now, is really just like I try as hard as possible to stay out of the vanity of things and like, oh, look at me and blah, but it's like, but I'm just having fun. And like, I'm not a super creative person. I love photography. But like, I'm not a painter or anything like that, or like, so on and so forth. And so like, this has, to your point, kind of become my art. Like, and that's just why I love doing it, is just being creative. But yeah, no, I had no intention of, it really was just an accident, as Bob Ross would say, a happy little accident. In 2018, my wife and I moved back from Washington State, and that's where I had learned to fly fish out there. And I moved back to Maryland, which is where I more or less grew up after my dad retired from being in the Navy. And, everyone was talking about like tying flies in the tying season. I'm like, what do you mean tying season? Don't you just keep fishing? And they're like, yeah, it gets colder, you don't get out as much, so you tie flies. And I was like, oh, okay. So I ended up basically being gifted advice from my dad, who he had learned to tie flies on when he was living in Scotland, stationed in Scotland, and tying Atlantic salmon flies. And so it's kind of funny. And he, I've joked with him about this, but it was literally like this hodgepodge tying kit it was a Griffin vise, which is an awesome vise to get started on. I absolutely loved it. But then like, it was my dad's a dentist, so most of the tools were dental tools, like old dental scissors and surgical scissors and stuff like that. And so just started tying flies and was just having fun with it, and really was tying to try and save some money, instead of buying and losing, because I was buying and losing a bunch of flies. And so, yeah, it kind of just happened. And that's the way I always explain it to people. And then it kind of just, one thing kind of led to another. And I think what really solidified tying and fly fishing in general as a lifelong thing for me in my life was not only being outdoors, like I mentioned, with your first question, but I ended up getting diagnosed with, which I never was super surprised with this. I ended up getting diagnosed with anxiety, and, was having anxiety attacks, didn't know it, ended up in the hospital a couple times, didn't know why, was trying to figure all this out. And tying and fly fishing especially were two things that I could, especially tying, like, if I couldn't get out on the water and I felt like I was really anxious or getting ready to have an anxiety attack, I could sit down at the vise, and because you're focusing on one thing at a time, I could sit down at the vise, forget about everything else, focus on one thing. And I've literally prevented or stopped anxiety attacks just from tying flies, or from fishing. And so, I'm in a different place now, God. But like I said, that kind of was when I was going through really the thick of that. That's kind of one of those things that, like I said, really solidified this, tying flies for me and made it like almost like a permanent thing in my life. And my wife thankfully understands that and recognizes the value that it has in my life and ultimately our life as a result. But yeah, so I ended up spending a lot of time behind the vise. I also was in seminary, started seminary, and, you know, I would tie flies I'm online, so I would tie flies while I would listen to my lectures or while I was listening to a book. And so I ended up just getting a lot of time behind the vise and really kind of unintentionally perfecting things.
I love that. And I appreciate your vulnerability there, Sharon, about your anxiety, because I know people very close to me suffer with that. And there are means, obviously not all fly tying, but to find ways to get through that, or at least begin the process. And I'm glad that you were able to accidentally find that, in a sense. So what's your favorite fly?
Oh my gosh.
Well, let me make it really difficult. What's your favorite fly to tie? And then we'll ask, what's your favorite fly to fish?
Well, let me not ask. Let me say this. My favorite fly to, oh gosh, that's a hard question too, actually. Favorite fly to tie. You know, I was actually just tying up some Krelix last night and this morning.
Okay.
And Krelix, are just one of those flies that I just find so satisfying to tie. I think because everything is so, like, you know, quote unquote clean, right? So like, I don't know have you ever tied or fished a Krelix?
Have not, actually.
Oh, you've never fished one either?
Similar, but not. I couldn't call it a Krelix.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I'd highly recommend it. Anyways, if you look up a photo, you'll kind of see what I'm talking about, probably. But it's a very meticulous fly, and it's really only kind of like 2 steps. But it turns out to be this really cool, really effective fly. But like I said, kind of just a very satisfying fly to tie, and that's kind of what I've always described it as, because you cut the tail, you know, perfectly straight, and then the front sections, again, you're cutting very, you know, you cut it flush with the end of the hook bend. So yeah, kind of just, like I said, a satisfying fly to tie. But favorite fly to fish, my most fished fly, I'll put it this way, my most fished fly and most productive fly is a fly called the pink hog, which is a variation of the pink squirrel, which is a driftless, Wisconsin driftless fly. It's just a jig, and I learned this is not my pattern, this is from a friend of mine. It's a jig version of the pink squirrel, so it's a flash tail, crystal flash tail, red wire, and squirrel dubbing, and it just is this really spiky, buggy fly, and that's my most, like I said, most fished fly and most productive fly, and the fly that I've had the most 20 plus fish on, probably. So 20 plus trout on, I should specify, sorry.
I will make sure that people find this in the show notes and all that kind of stuff. What do you think it is about that fly that has produced what you just testified to?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, actually. So I think it's twofold. I think one is the squirrel dubbing is just so, I mean, when you look at the fly, and you can find a picture on either probably my Instagram or on my website, or you could just Google it and it'll probably come up. But so when you make the fly, there's a couple different ways to do it, but basically you're using squirrel dubbing because it's quote unquote spiky, and it has those guard hair fibers that really stick out. And so when you look at the fly, a picture of the fly, it basically looks like a giant fuzzball. And I think to answer your question, I think part of what makes it so effective is that, we talk about bugginess with a fly, right? And of course that really means 800 different things depending on who you ask. But I think what does make it quote unquote buggy is like that spikiness looks like legs, and you could say the gills of like a mayfly, right? Especially I think it's the crawlers that have those like really those gills that move a lot on their abdomen.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of it, is they look like legs. But then I think I thought about it time and time again because I fish other flies for fun. Variety is the spice of life, right? And so I can't fish the same fly over and over and over again. So I try other flies, and like I've just had it time and time again where I'm like fishing other flies, and then I'm like, all right, I'm going to put this on just because, like, Old Reliable. And then it's like first cast, like boom. So, and of course, depending on who you ask, professionally wise, like, well, maybe you used the bigger, it was, faster sink rate or slower sink rate, or, well, and I'm like, maybe it is, maybe. And it's very possible that that's what it is. But I think a big part of it is the flash tail, actually. And I think it looks like an emerger. And so even though it's a heavy nymph you could tie it super heavy to get down. The tail on the pink squirrel, the original pink squirrel, is designed to be like an emerging shuck, or shuck of an emerger. And I think really that's what part of what does it is, that it's that bugginess and the tail, I think, get the attention of fish. Whether it's the first one over the second one or second one over the first one, who knows? I'm sure we'll never know. Yeah, I think those are the two things, in my opinion. And then you can go into bead color. I know I've gotten to know Josh Miller from the U.S. team, U.S. fly fishing team, pretty well over the last couple of years, and he's actually big on bead color, and he likes silver the best, but also pink, because pink is really kind of close to silver. But he says that they take on the color of their surrounding. So a silver bead can be fished light days or dark days, because the silver reflects the light that it's being given. And he says the same is true about pink. So that could be why as well. Who knows?
Yeah, I was curious about that for my own personal, because I have a fly that I've been messing around with for a couple of years. I call it the Pink Lady, and I am the Crelex fly, among others, are flies that I have, because of my crotchetiness, have avoided because I have been so not anti-flash, but like just I don't know. I guess my thoughts are still caught up in, and I've come a long way with this just in the last year, of there's nothing that's like that in the water, so therefore I'm not even going to try it, and I won't have confidence in it anyways. Well, I literally, after doing a couple competitions over the last couple of years and realizing going up with some of the best people in the world, and I'm like, and I'm asking them, like, well, how many fish you catch? And they're telling me, and they're like, I'm like, do you mind if I ask you what fly? And then they're like, a mop fly. I'm like, what?
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, a mop fly. And they're like, oh, yeah. And I'm like, oh, my gosh. And
that's funny.
You look in my box, and there was no mop flies. So you look in my box present, there are mop flies. So
that's funny.
Somebody had turned me on to those metallic pink beads a couple years ago. And I'm like, well, I'm not just going to make the whole thing crazy. Like that was the extent of my flash and a fly for a long time.
Yeah.
And now that it's in there and do a little bit of things with it, it has become one of my most effective flies on like the little juniata or something for wild fish. And it's, again, to your same thing, why, I have no idea. But it's just interesting that that you're seeing something slightly similar to that. But well, here's a question. So you kind of have your hands in a couple different things, but they're all, in my opinion, from like hearing it and watching it, kind of imagining your life as you're explaining it, there's nothing is pulling against each other too severely. I mean, your time flies, so you're in the industry, you're doing some other things in the fly fishing industry, but you're in seminary pursuing, a calling career in being a pastor, but then you have that place where they kind of combined there with altar. So with all that said, what would you say to somebody and they wanted to, for lack of better terms, get into that kind of that field? And really, I guess what I'm asking is, how do you find that passion, that calling? Because that's a big question. Because as a Christian, there's no one passage. Actually, as far as I understand from all the digging, there isn't a place that you can go and say, well, here, this verse says this about calling. Okay, that makes everything go.
Yeah.
It's different. It's a lived out reality, I think, and something happens. How would you explain that from your own experience to encourage everybody? And I don't just mean people in ministry or something like that. I mean in general.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And immediately what comes to mind, and this is a huge part of this story, is early on in seminary. So I'm at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is in California. And I really have enjoyed my experience there. And so one thing that Fuller does really well is they do a great job of forming the pastor or ministry leader as a person. And that's something that I'm grateful for, because from my understanding, that's not a lot of things that a lot of pastors have received or do still receive. And a lot of pastors get out of seminary and are like, well, I learned nothing about real life in seminary. Or not real life, but real church life.
Yes.
And so I read a book early on in one of the classes that we were required to take on formation. And the name of the book is Called. And it is written by the former president of Fuller, Mark Laverton. And one of the things that really stuck out to me in that book was this quote, and this is not his quote, he's quoting someone else. And it's to the effect of, God's calling on your life is where the world's deep need meets your great passion. And that really, really stuck out to me. And I was in this time of really contemplating that idea and that concept of, okay, God, what is your calling on my life? And to your point, I was obviously going to scripture and having conversations, and, going back to one of your questions earlier, I had a really foundational conversation with one of he's our current, prior senior pastor, now current associate pastor, about kind of this notion of calling. And I was really wrestling with this idea of, okay, I have this really huge passion, obviously, for ministry and God's word and helping other people too, and teaching. But then I had this really growing passion for fly fishing and being outdoors in general. And like I said, that's something that it was always huge in my life, but this was as I was wrestling with this reality of anxiety. And so this was all like really kind of all happening at the same time. And like my world was exploding basically. Thankfully we didn't have children at that point, because it was a crazy season. Not that we wouldn't have made it through it. It just would have made it more difficult. But as I was wrestling through all of this was actually when I met Eric, the founder of Altar, at a fly fishing show. And it's 100% a God story, because it's one of these things like you couldn't draw it up, right? So I was wrestling with all of this, really trying to figure out, God, is there a way to make these two passions meet? Because it's like, it doesn't seem like it, because I'm like, there's fly fishing, which is, not the church, and then there's the church, which is the church and ministry, right? And like, is there a way to make the two meet? And I met Eric at the fly show, and this was the first year of Altar, and they just went to a fly show to kind of get their name out there. And I was there with my dad, and I walked by the booth, we walked by the booth, and I turned to my dad and I was like, was that a cross in that logo? And so I turned around. I literally said that out loud to him, and I turned around. I was like, oh, sure enough, it was. So we stood there and talked to him for an hour almost, him and his brother-in-law who was helping him run the booth. And I didn't know this at the time, but he later told me. But I walked away, and he turned to his brother-in-law and said, wouldn't it be cool if that guy worked for Altar someday? And so then here I am. But yeah, like I said, going back, I think that was a huge piece for me, is that quote from that book of God's calling is where the world's great need meets your great passion. And I think you can obviously take that quote a couple different ways, and you have to, I think you could preface that by saying, through a lot of prayer, which I think Laverton is probably assuming that the reader is taking that into consideration as well. But yeah, like I said, I think that kind of concept of, okay. And so the conversation actually that I had with our pastor that I said was pretty foundational was, this was actually before I went to seminary, but kind of stuck with me through this whole process of, okay, I was talking to him because I was like, I feel like God's calling me to seminary, but I don't want to make the wrong choice, basically. And so kind of, again, to go back to your question of like, well, I didn't want to do something bad or wrong. And he was like, Howie, you're stuck in the mud right now. And he went on to say, like, you have to make a choice. He was like, if you just stay stuck in the mud, you're not going to do anything. And you're just going to sit in this place of not knowing what to do or where to go, and you're not going to do anything. And he was like, you have to make a choice, obviously try and make the choice you think God is really calling you to. And so he was like, it sounds like God is calling you to seminary, but I can't make that choice for you. But he was like, and if that's not the right choice, God is going to correct you. It's not like your world's going to fall apart, or you're going to hell, or so on and so forth. He was like, if it's the wrong choice, God will let you know and correct your path. And I was just like, shoot, you're right. And so, like I said, that kind of stuck with me through that process that I just explained of like the world's deep need meets your great passion. And so I have a passion for teaching and for helping others. And then I also have a passion for fly fishing. And so I'm kind of doing a little bit of both right now. I work at our church part-time, almost full-time, 30 hours a week. And then I work at our fly shop 1 day a week, our local fly shop 1 day a week. And then I'm technically with Altar 5 days a week, but most of that time culminates on the trips. And so it's a little bit of everything. And I mean, truthfully, life, things can be a little chaotic sometimes, trying to remember where I need to be what day. And then doing seminary on top of that and taking care of a family as well. But I love what I do, and I'm thankful for that. Because I think I am fortunate enough to be living out that concept of, okay, God's placed this great passion in me, and I'm taking it and living into it fully, where there is a huge need in pastors, and in people in general. So wow. Hopefully that wasn't too much rambling.
No, not at all. I love it. And it's important. I mean, I take encouragement from that, because it's been a struggle my entire life, because my background's all over the place. I'm like the mutt of theology, and a lot of those things didn't jive. The foundations always did, but some of the other more specific things, or at least things I thought should be specific, was a well-articulated experiential testimony of what most people say, and I think it's kind of right. just throw something on the wall and see if it sticks, in a sense, where you got to find those things that are in you. And then for me, it was getting over that kind of Appalachian mindset of, no, you don't do something that you love and make money at it, because money's a part of this. We're not going to pretend it's not. None of us can live for free. So you just grind away at something that you hate, and then you come home and you try to find time to do all this other stuff, when in reality there's passions, there's gifts that have seemingly been put into every person on this planet that I encourage, and I think from your story we received that encouragement to find those and get involved in them. Do what you can to, as you're doing in seminary, you're quote, perfecting that. You're growing in it. You're becoming better at it so that you can do the outworkings of it better for the people and so forth, and meet that need in culture and in the world and so forth.
Yeah.
Well, I got one more slightly deeper question, and then I want you to just tell people where we can find information about you. And the last question here is really, is there any question you wish I would have asked?
Is there any question I wish you would have asked? That's a good question. I'm sure there's questions. I could talk for days, right? So I love talking about different things and fly fishing and stuff like that.
How about a good fishing story? Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, one thing I love talking about with new people and on the couple podcasts I've been on is like, and I've been asked this question a couple times, and I like answering it, is the idea of like, what would you say to someone who's getting started in fly tying? And I think the same is kind of true for fly fishing, especially nowadays. But like, if you think you're gonna get started in fly tying and you think it's gonna be a lifelong passion of yours, go get a nice vise and nice tools. It doesn't have to be $1,000, but skip past the box kit, and you'll save yourself a lot of headache. There's a couple vices that are around the $200 range that are really, really good vices, and I'd recommend that. Don't go for the $59 Cabela's one or Amazon special, stuff like that, because it's going to be a nightmare unless you think or know it's just going to be something that you're just doing for fun every now and then. By all means, those will get the job done. Like I said, I started on a Griffin Odyssey vise, and I think retail it's $110, $120. Phenomenal vise, and you can find it at most fly shops. And then also too, the thing that I always love talking to people about is like, and I hate saying this every time I say it, I hate saying it, but it's also true. It's like, just do you. And it's like, the epitome of the culture right now is just do you, which, like I said, I hate saying that, but it's like, there's 100 different ways to tie 100 different flies, and you can use different materials and so on and so forth. And it's like, if you're not using the exact material or the specific technique, but it works and catches fish, then it works and it catches fish and you're having fun doing it. I definitely think there's places where you shouldn't substitute certain materials, like hackle's one of them, and hackle's obviously one of the more expensive things, but like good hackle is a night and day difference. But then there's some things like, dubbing, and there's stuff that you can certainly find at craft stores and stuff like that. But then there's other things where it's like, it's not that it can't be done a certain way, but it's like, it's going to make your life a lot easier and save you a lot of headaches if you are able to and do bite the bullet on, buying the right fly tying materials. But again, at the same time, like, if you're having fun and you're catching fish, and there's so much joy in catching a fish, especially like those first couple fish, you're like, oh my gosh, I think I've actually got this down. Like, I think I'm getting the hang of this thing. And you're like, wow, I tied a fly that caught a fish, and maybe even an awesome fish. So yeah.
Heck yeah. I love it. Well, brother, man, tell listeners how some places that they can maybe find some more info about you, or just find you on the world of social media or something.
Yeah. So I have my own social media, mainly Instagram. Howard the Duck 23 is my Instagram name, and then I have my own website, which is fishersflies.com. I also have a YouTube, actually, that's kind of, again, going back to the conversation about like great need meeting. Well, not necessarily great need, but kind of the crossing of passions. Like I said, I love teaching. And so I didn't want to start a YouTube, and I put it off actually for like a year or two probably. And then eventually I was just like, let's give this thing a try. And I'm having a lot of fun, like I said, doing it, being creative. And I certainly don't know everything. I will admit that right off the bat, but like, I just love teaching what I do know, and sharing knowledge with people. And especially coming from the side of where like I was kind of getting at with that last question of like, I've had a lot of negative interactions with a lot of grouchy people of all ages saying, oh, that's not the way that's supposed to be done. Or, you can't use that material, or that's not that. And it's like, well, who are you to say that it is or isn't? Or, and just like, I don't want other people to have that experience. And so, and again, like I said, I think there's certainly places where, like I said, you shouldn't make substitutions just for lack of, headache and ease of use.
Yeah.
But like, if it works and you find out a way to make it work, and then I get it works. So I try and preach that kind of a lot on my YouTube channel, and my YouTube channel is tying videos, by the way.
Right.
And I try and keep the format pretty short. So most of my videos are like 5 to 10 minutes. Some are a little bit longer, some are a little bit shorter, but kind of just sweet and to the point. And then too, the Alter Fly Fishing page, so alterflyfishing.org. And then I also run like I said, I work for our local fly shop, Precision Fly Fishing, 1 day a week, and I help run the social media there too. So yeah, all sorts of different ways.
I love it. Now make sure everybody can find those things in all the appropriate locations of all this podcast stuffiness.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, I really appreciate you making the time for myself and for everybody that's going to participate in hearing this later on. I think it's encouraging. I think it will be good stuff for an awful lot of people. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And we're not too far from each other, so let's try and fish in this new year.
That's some good stuff, right? I want to say a quick word of encouragement for anybody that's listening to this, that maybe you've got a little bit of the eye roll, because we talked a lot about God. We talked about our faith. And towards the end there, Howie had given kind of an explanation of how calling kind of happened to him, and that intersection of felt needs and the ability for humanity, to meet each other's needs culturally, personally, whatever the case is. And I'm going to say something that's going to sound controversial to my Christian friends, but I think if you understood me, and if I can get it out correctly, you'll understand altogether. The book of Acts has this really neat story where the Apostle Paul is talking to a group of people who believe in spiritual things. And he finds this altar that says "To an Unknown God" inscribed on it. And now this was obviously a group of people open to metaphysical things, right? And you may not be. Just keep an open mind for this, because he goes on to talk about a lot of things, but he makes a comment that I want to read to you, and then it kind of explains something. He says, "From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth." I think we can agree on at least a portion of that, right? And then he says, he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. I want to say two things. One, you're not where you are, and you don't have the passions you have by accident. You don't have to be a Christian to find those passions and to live them out. The problem that happens is when you try to explain the ontological groundings for them. That is to say, to explain where that even comes from and why it makes sense. And I would say I'm okay with that for you for a while, but I would say don't stay there. As Howie said in What They Do with Altered, is be intentional. Find those things when you discover things as beautiful as wonder and the significance of love from somebody else. And they move you so much and they make the universe seem so big. It's okay to ask the questions why and to investigate. Because I think you'll end up where Howie and I and many other people have in our understanding of those being a relational and personal and a planned thing from a creator. But find those passions, fill those passions, walk in them. And Howie, again, thank you so much for your time and for the flies. And friends, you need to go check out Howie's flies. Find his Instagram, his Facebook, and his YouTube. Give him a shout out. And till the next time, remember, it's not about the destination. It's the journey that makes us.